Chapter 1, The City. This is AI. True Crime, and today, we're beginning episode 3 of our series on LA's most famous unsolved murder, the Black Dahlia. Los Angeles in 1947 was not a city that encouraged staying still. It rewarded movement, improvisation, and the ability to exist without documentation. People arrived with suitcases that held less than their intentions. They took rooms where they could find them and jobs that rarely came with promises. The city was wide, loosely organized, and only partially supervised, which meant you could disappear into it without much effort. The war had ended, but its aftereffects were everywhere. Men returned trained to follow routines built around violence and urgency, then were expected to adjust quietly. Some managed it. Others drifted between bars, rented rooms, and parked cars. Los Angeles absorbed them without comment. It had space, and space made problems feel less immediate. Housing shortages shaped daily life. Apartments were divided until they barely functioned. Spare rooms were rented without leases or questions. Hotels cared about payment and little else. A person could move from one address to another without leaving a clear trail, especially if permanence was not the goal. For women, independence existed, but it was fragile and conditional. Being alone drew attention. Attention could become opportunity or danger depending on who noticed and when. Cars mattered more here than in most American cities. They created private space in public places. Conversations happened inside them. Decisions were made there. You could cross neighborhoods quickly and be somewhere new before anyone thought to look for you. The city's reliance on automobiles made it easy to blur boundaries and harder to track movement. Police authority was uneven and personal. Officers worked cases based on familiarity rather than formal coordination. Records existed, but they stayed local. Departments shared information selectively, often through relationships rather than systems. Los Angeles County was too large and too fragmented to manage cleanly. Mistakes were common and rarely corrected in real time. The press operated with fewer constraints than the police. Newspapers competed aggressively, and sensational stories sold best. Reporters cultivated officers who liked seeing their version of events in print. Leaks were not accidents. Once information appeared in the paper, it hardened quickly, even if it was incomplete or wrong. Vacant land interrupted residential streets throughout the city. Empty lots were common enough that people stopped noticing them. They served practical purposes: shortcuts, parking spaces, places to dump unwanted things. They did not feel threatening until something forced them into focus. Sex was present everywhere but discussed carefully. It was sold, implied, joked about, and quietly negotiated. The film industry depended on desire while publicly regulating it. Morality was flexible as long as it stayed discreet. A woman could be pursued and judged at the same time, often by the same people. This was the environment Elizabeth Short moved through when she returned to Los Angeles. It was not uniquely corrupt or uniquely cruel. It was permissive in uneven ways. It offered opportunity without stability and anonymity without protection. People learned to navigate it through charm, caution, and constant adjustment. When her body was found, the city reacted the way it had been trained to react. With speed, noise, and confidence. Conclusions formed quickly because the environment encouraged them. A young woman without a fixed address could be shaped into whatever cautionary figure the moment required. Los Angeles preferred to believe its violence stayed hidden, behind doors and inside cars. A body left in an open lot disrupted that belief. It made private brutality public. It forced the city to look at spaces it usually ignored. Afterward, daily life continued. Buses ran. Bars opened. Rooms were rented. The city absorbed the shock and kept moving. What remained was a sense that something had slipped through gaps everyone pretended were manageable, not because of a single failure, but because of how the city functioned. Chapter 2: The Press. The newspapers arrived before the facts had settled. In some cases, they arrived before the police did. Reporters moved quickly through Los Angeles, listening for sirens, watching for uniforms, calling contacts who had learned what mattered long before it appeared on any blotter. By the time Elizabeth Short's name was confirmed, the shape of the story was already forming in newsrooms across the city. Los Angeles supported multiple daily papers, each trying to outdo the others. Sensation was not a side effect. It was the product. Crime stories sold best when they were sharp, visual, and easy to summarize. Complexity slowed things down. Uncertainty was inconvenient. What mattered was momentum. The body provided that immediately. The condition of it. The way it had been arranged. The absence of blood. Those details were repeated because they were concrete and unsettling. They could be described without interpretation. They gave readers something to picture. From there, the embellishment came easily. The nicknames solved several problems at once. Black Dahlia sounded dangerous and stylish. It suggested sexuality without saying much directly. It turned Elizabeth Short into a figure rather than a person. Once that happened, the papers no longer needed her history to make sense. They could invent a version of her that fit the story they wanted to tell. Reporters leaned hard into implication. They described her clothes, her makeup, her social life. They listed bars and hotels in a way that suggested pattern rather than coincidence. Attention was framed as intent. Presence became participation. Any gap in the record was filled with suggestion. Police did not resist this. In some cases, they encouraged it. Leaks kept pressure off the department by redirecting attention toward unnamed suspects or dramatic theories. Officers spoke off the record and then pretended surprise when their words appeared in print. The relationship was informal and mutually beneficial. Accuracy became secondary to repetition. Once a detail appeared in one paper, others picked it up. Corrections rarely traveled as far as the original claim. A mistake printed early could live on for years, cited by people who no longer remembered where it came from. Elizabeth Short's own voice never entered the coverage. Letters were paraphrased. Conversations were recalled secondhand. Friends were quoted selectively. Her inner life was reconstructed based on how she looked and where she had been seen. The result was a character who felt knowable and hollow at the same time. The press also shaped how the violence itself was understood. Certain details were emphasized while others were glossed over. Control and deliberation became obsession. The crime was framed as spectacular rather than procedural. This encouraged the idea that the person responsible was extraordinary, clever, or uniquely cruel, rather than someone operating within familiar patterns. As the days passed, speculation replaced reporting. Columnists weighed in. Experts appeared. Psychologists offered profiles based on fragments. The story expanded outward, picking up whatever it could carry. Each edition made the original facts harder to see. Readers consumed the coverage eagerly. The case offered fear without proximity and intimacy without consequence. It allowed people to imagine danger while remaining safely removed from it. The papers gave them a version of the city that felt thrilling and contained. By the time investigators tried to correct the narrative, it was too late. The public already knew who Elizabeth Short was supposed to be. Any information that contradicted that version struggled to gain traction. The story had momentum, and momentum favored what was already familiar. What began as reporting became infrastructure. Future books, films, and theories would draw from these early accounts, inheriting their assumptions and errors. The press did not just cover the case. It set the terms under which it would be remembered. From that point forward, anyone trying to understand what happened had to work against the story that had been printed first, loudest, and most often. Chapter 3: Movement. Elizabeth Short was not unusual in how she moved through Los Angeles, but she was unusually visible. She did not stay in one place long enough to become background. She arrived, settled briefly, and then shifted again, sometimes by choice and sometimes because staying put stopped being an option. That pattern made sense in a city built to reward motion and forgive disappearance. She stayed with friends when she could. When that wore thin, she looked for hotels that did not require much beyond payment and good behavior in public spaces. Lobbies mattered. They were places where you could wait without being questioned, where presence implied purpose. Sitting with a purse on your lap and your legs crossed read as expectation, not need. No one asked what you were waiting for if you looked like someone who had somewhere to go next. Bars and coffee shops served a similar function. You could be seen without committing to anything. You could talk without agreeing. She understood that distinction. People later described her as friendly, charming, and careful. Those traits were not contradictions. They were tools. Being pleasant kept conversations open. Being careful kept exits available. Cars shaped much of this movement. Rides were offered casually and often accepted. A car promised speed and temporary privacy, but it also transferred control. Accepting a ride meant trusting someone long enough to reach the destination, or long enough to decide you needed to get out. In Los Angeles, refusing a ride could be read as suspicion. Accepting one could be read as invitation. The ambiguity benefited the person offering it more than the person taking it. Short was adept at navigating that imbalance. Accounts describe her as attentive without being intimate. She listened, laughed when expected, and kept her plans vague. That vagueness was protective. People remembered her later because she did not give them much to remember. They filled in the gaps themselves. The city made this kind of movement easy. Addresses changed quickly. Rooms were rented without paperwork. People passed through each other's lives without leaving much trace. It was possible to know someone well enough to offer help and still know almost nothing about them. That looseness was treated as freedom until something went wrong. When police later tried to reconstruct her final days, they relied on memory rather than records. Who saw her where? Who spoke to her? Who thought they remembered the time? Each account was shaped by hindsight. Conversations that had seemed ordinary suddenly felt charged. Offers that had been casual took on weight. Some men overstated their importance. Others minimized it. Being connected to the case carried risk and attention in equal measure. Saying too much could implicate you. Saying too little could make you seem suspicious. The safest position was often to say something that sounded helpful without committing to detail. What emerges from these accounts is not a clear path, but a series of overlaps. Short appears briefly in multiple places, then disappears from them just as quickly. She was not hiding. She was doing what many people did in that city at that time, moving through social spaces without anchoring herself to any one of them. This kind of movement frustrated investigators who preferred fixed locations and stable routines. It also frustrated later writers who wanted a clean sequence of events. The reality was messier. Her last days were not a countdown. They were a continuation of a pattern that had worked often enough to feel manageable. That pattern depended on reading people quickly and adjusting constantly. Most of the time, that skill kept her safe. It helped her find places to stay and conversations to have. It allowed her to remain visible without being owned by any one situation. At some point, the balance shifted. The movement that had protected her stopped doing so. Whether that happened because of a single decision or a slow accumulation of risk is impossible to say with certainty. What is clear is that the city offered many moments where that shift could occur without notice. Afterward, her movements were treated as evidence rather than survival. Every stop became suspect. Every interaction was examined for motive. The ordinary act of going somewhere was transformed into a clue. In the process, the texture of how she actually lived those days was flattened into a list. What remains is the sense of a person navigating a city that required constant negotiation, using the tools available to her, until those tools were no longer enough. Chapter 4: Authority. Police authority in Los Angeles was less a system than a collection of habits. Officers worked the city the way they worked people, relying on familiarity, reputation, and instinct. Formal procedure existed, but it bent easily. What mattered most was who you knew, how long you'd been around, and whether you were considered reliable by the people above you. The department was large, but coordination was loose. Jurisdictions overlapped without sharing much information. Records stayed where they were created. A lead taken seriously in one division could be ignored in another without explanation. This was not negligence in the dramatic sense. It was routine. The city was too spread out and too busy for anything else. Investigators preferred fixed points. Addresses. Jobs. Family connections. People who could be located again if needed. Elizabeth Short did not fit that preference. She moved too often, stayed too briefly, and left too little behind. Reconstructing her life required talking to people who remembered her vaguely and places that kept no records. This made interviews unreliable from the start. Witnesses were asked to recall conversations that had seemed unimportant at the time. Dates blurred. Locations shifted. Details were filled in unconsciously. Each retelling altered the shape of what was remembered. Police notes captured fragments rather than narratives. The department also worked under constant pressure from the press. Information leaked quickly and selectively. Officers learned to perform competence even when they lacked clarity. Announcing progress mattered almost as much as making it. Leads were sometimes pursued because they looked good in print rather than because they made sense. False confessions complicated matters further. The case attracted men who wanted attention, men who believed they could talk their way into relevance, and men who confused fantasy with memory. Sorting these out took time and patience, both of which were in short supply. Each confession created paperwork and expectation, even when it collapsed quickly. Internal disagreements slowed progress. Different theories competed quietly within the department. Some investigators believed the crime was personal. Others believed it was opportunistic. These differences were not resolved so much as sidestepped. Without consensus, efforts scattered. What the police did have was confidence in their instincts. That confidence did not always serve them well. Certain possibilities were dismissed early because they did not fit expectations. Others were favored because they aligned with familiar narratives. Once a theory took hold, contradictory evidence struggled to gain traction. Mistakes were rarely acknowledged in real time. Evidence mishandled early remained mishandled. Witnesses questioned poorly were not always revisited. The assumption was that the next lead would correct the last problem. Often it did not. This approach was not unique to this case. It reflected how policing operated in the city more broadly. Problems were addressed as they arose, not as part of a coordinated strategy. Success depended heavily on individual effort rather than institutional design. As weeks passed, the gap between what the police knew and what the public believed widened. Confidence remained, but clarity did not. The investigation continued, but its shape was already constrained by early decisions and missed opportunities. Authority was visible everywhere in the case, but effectiveness was harder to locate. The department looked busy. It sounded certain. Underneath that surface, it struggled to impose order on a situation that resisted it. By the time investigators realized how limited their position had become, the case was no longer just a matter of evidence. It was an expectation, sustained by repetition and confidence rather than resolution. Chapter 5: The Gap. What finally stalled the investigation was not a single missed clue or dramatic mistake, but the steady accumulation of small gaps that never closed. Each one looked manageable when it appeared. A witness who could not remember an exact date. A hotel ledger that had already been discarded. A phone call logged without a name. None of these felt decisive in isolation. Together, they formed a structure that could not support resolution. Police continued working the case, but their movement became circular. Leads were followed, reported, and quietly abandoned. New information was filtered through assumptions that had formed early and hardened quickly. Possibilities that did not fit those assumptions were acknowledged and then set aside, not out of malice, but out of habit. The investigation did not stop. It narrowed itself. Time worked against clarity in predictable ways. Witnesses became harder to locate. Some moved out of the city. Some decided they wanted no further involvement. Others remained available but less precise, their memories reshaped by repetition and suggestion. Confidence replaced accuracy. A story told often enough began to feel true even when its details shifted. The city made this process easier. Los Angeles was built to absorb error without reacting to it. Its size allowed mistakes to disappear into distance. Its pace discouraged pause. By the time someone realized a question had not been asked or a lead had not been followed far enough, the conditions that made it relevant were already gone. Within the department, attention drifted naturally. New crimes arrived. New pressures emerged. The Dahlia file remained open, but urgency faded. Notes multiplied without adding clarity. Early missteps became embedded in the record, difficult to correct without unraveling everything that had come after them. The press continued to fill space. When no new facts appeared, repetition took their place. Old details were reprinted. Familiar angles were revisited. Each retelling gave the impression of movement while leaving the underlying facts untouched. Readers assumed progress because the story remained visible. That visibility worked against resolution. An unsolved case that stays in circulation becomes familiar. Familiarity dulls demand. What once felt like a rupture settled into routine uncertainty. The question shifted from, "What happened?" to, "Why is this still unsolved?" a framing that allowed failure to feel inevitable rather than preventable. Elizabeth Short's life outside the crime continued to recede. Her movement through the city, the decisions she made to get through each day, were flattened into a single moment where everything ended. The city preferred that version. It was easier to contain. What remained were the gaps themselves. Not dramatic absences, but ordinary ones. The kind produced by loose systems, uneven authority, and a city that allowed people to pass through without leaving much behind. Those gaps did not announce themselves as fatal. They simply stayed open. By the time anyone tried to take stock of what had been lost, the case was no longer something that could be fixed by finding one missing piece. It had become a structure built around what was no longer available. The investigation continued in form, but not in function. This was not a collapse. It was a settling. The case did not end. It hardened into place, carried forward by repetition and belief rather than evidence. Chapter 6: What Stayed Open. By the time the investigation slowed to a crawl, the city had already adjusted. Los Angeles was good at that. It absorbed disruption quickly and without ceremony. The vacant lot where Elizabeth Short was found did not become sacred ground. It remained a piece of land waiting to be used. Grass grew back unevenly. People walked past it without stopping. Whatever shock had existed there was temporary. Inside the police department, the case shifted categories. It was no longer urgent, but it was not abandoned. Detectives still answered calls about it. Tips still arrived. Letters still came in from people convinced they had noticed something important years earlier. Each new piece of information was logged, considered briefly, and then added to a file that had already become unwieldy. The problem was not a lack of effort. It was the absence of leverage. The early gaps had become permanent features. Evidence that had been mishandled could not be restored. Witnesses who had moved on could not be recalled accurately. Records that had never existed could not be reconstructed. Every attempt to move forward ran into the same structural limits. What remained active was interpretation. The case invited it. With no clear resolution, attention turned toward pattern and speculation. Certain details took on outsized importance. The precision of the cuts. The washing of the body. The placement in the lot. Each was treated as a key, even when no lock could be found to fit it. This focus on detail gave the impression of depth. People believed the case endured because it was complex, because it resisted easy answers. In reality, it endured because it had been shaped early into something that could not be resolved within the systems available at the time. Complexity was layered on afterward. The city played a quiet role in sustaining this. Los Angeles liked mysteries that confirmed its self-image. A crime that could not be solved fit neatly into a narrative about scale, anonymity, and danger. The idea that some things simply slipped through reinforced the city's sense of itself as too large to fully control. Elizabeth Short's name remained attached to that idea, even as the details of her life faded. She became a fixed reference point rather than a person. Her movements before her death were reduced to a prelude. Her relationships were treated as clues rather than connections. The city remembered the case more clearly than it remembered her. As years passed, the investigation existed mostly as maintenance. Files were reviewed occasionally. New detectives familiarized themselves with the basics. The same questions were asked in slightly different ways. No one expected a breakthrough, but no one wanted to be responsible for closing the door completely. This in-between state became permanent. The case was neither active nor resolved. It was available for use. Journalists returned to it when they needed a story. Writers used it to explore their own theories. The absence of conclusion made room for endless revisiting. What rarely changed was the underlying structure. The same early decisions, the same lost opportunities, continued to define what could be known. Later work did not replace those foundations. It built on them, reinforcing their limits. In that sense, the case never moved very far from where it began. It remained anchored to the moment when a body was found and a city reacted quickly and noisily. Everything that followed operated within the frame established in those first days. The failure to resolve the case was not mysterious. It was procedural, cultural, and structural. It reflected how information moved, how authority functioned, and how quickly a narrative could solidify around incomplete facts. By the end of this phase, what mattered was not who might have been responsible, but how the city had learned to live with not knowing. The open case became a feature rather than a problem, something carried forward without expectation. That unresolved state would shape everything that came next. The suspects, the theories, the obsession. All of it grew out of what had been left open early on and never closed. This is AI. True crime. The intelligence is artificial. But the crime is real. AI True Crime is written by ChatGPT, art by Midjourney, music composed by Murika.